I never thought I'd be the kind of person writing a post like this, but lately, my life has felt unreal enough that putting it into words is the only way I can make sense of it. I'm 27 years old, I live in Chicago, and until very recently, I thought I was in a stable, adult, long-term relationship. The kind you assume will naturally turn into something bigger because it's already survived time, routine, and boredom. I had a job I worked hard for, a small apartment that finally felt like home, and a boyfriend I genuinely believed I knew. His name was Ethan, and we had been together a little over 2 years. Not on and off, not casual, not seeing where things go. 2 full years of consistency. We met through mutual friends, clicked almost immediately, and slid into a relationship so easily that I took it as a sign it was meant to be. We had rituals that made our lives feel intertwined. Grocery shopping together on Sundays, Netflix marathons that always ended with us falling asleep on the couch, awkward but well-intentioned holiday dinners with each other's families. We even tried a couple's yoga class once because Ethan insisted it would be good for us, even though we both clearly hated every second of it. From the outside, we looked solid. From the inside, I thought we were solid too. We had started talking about the future in vague but hopeful ways. Nothing dramatic like engagements or wedding boards, but conversations about maybe moving in together later in the year, about neighborhoods we liked, about how much money we could save if we shared rent. Those talks made me feel secure, like I was building towards something real with someone who wanted the same thing. Ethan also had this very specific way of presenting himself to the world. He was confident, ambitious, always talking about his career in marketing and how hard he worked. He dressed well, knew the right buzzwords, and spoke with the kind of certainty that made people assume he knew what he was doing. I was proud of him, or at least proud of the version of him I thought existed. That said, there were small things that bothered me, things I learned to ignore because they didn't seem big enough to matter. Ethan had a habit of commenting on my appearance under the guise of honesty. Not outright insults, never anything I could easily call out without sounding sensitive. Just little remarks that lingered longer than they should have. He'd say a certain dress wasn't flattering, or suggest a different hairstyle because it would suit my face better. Sometimes he'd phrase it like advice, sometimes like a joke, but it always left me second-guessing myself. I told myself that relationships required thick skin, that he was just being direct, that he meant well. Looking back now, that was probably the moment I started shrinking without realizing it. Ethan also loved talking about his job, but he kept that part of his life strangely separate from me. I never met his boss, never attended work events, never really understood who he worked with beyond a few names. Whenever I asked, he'd say it wasn't professional or that it would be awkward. I accepted that explanation because it sounded reasonable and because I trusted him. Or at least, I thought I did. My own life was simpler. I worked as a retail manager, something I'd spent years building toward. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and I was proud of it. I paid my bills, showed up for my responsibilities, and tried to be a decent partner. I never felt like my job was something to apologize for, even if Ethan sometimes spoke about it like it was temporary or lesser. Still, I ignored the unease. I ignored the moments where his confidence felt a little too rehearsed, where his stories didn't always line up perfectly. I told myself I was overthinking, that not every inconsistency meant something deeper. Then came the invitation. One Friday afternoon, Ethan texted me and asked if I wanted to join him for dinner with a couple of people from his office. It caught me off guard in a good way. After 2 years, he was finally including me in that part of his life. I felt chosen, like this was a step forward, like maybe he was finally comfortable blending his worlds together. I got genuinely excited. I went shopping that evening, even though my budget didn't really allow for it, because I wanted to look nice. Not flashy, not overdone, just put together. I spent more time than usual getting ready, following a makeup tutorial I'd saved weeks ago, using the fancy hair straightener I normally reserved for special occasions. I wanted to feel confident walking in there beside him. I didn't realize then that this dinner would change how I saw the past 2 years of my life. As I was getting ready, I remember feeling nervous in a way that didn't make sense. My stomach felt tight, like I was preparing for a test I hadn't studied for. I brushed that off too, telling myself it was just first impression jitters, that this mattered because he mattered. I left my apartment thinking I was walking into a normal evening, An expensive dinner, maybe a little awkward small talk, then home together like always. I had no idea that this was the last night I would ever see Ethan the way I used to. The restaurant Ethan chose was one of those places that looks impressive from the outside, but immediately makes you uncomfortable once you step in. Dim lighting, minimalist decor, tiny tables packed too close together, and menus without prices. The kind of place where you know you're going to regret ordering anything that sounds even slightly interesting. It was located in downtown Chicago, surrounded by glass buildings and valet parking, which already had my anxiety creeping up before I even walked inside. I arrived 2 minutes late, literally 2. Parking downtown on a Friday night was a nightmare, and by the time I rushed in, I was already flustered. Ethan was seated at a table near the center of the restaurant, with 2 men I recognized from his stories as co-workers, Mark and Julian. They were both dressed casually but confidently, the way people do when they think they belong somewhere. Ethan barely stood when I approached, just a half rise from his chair, a quick glance at his watch, and a flat, "You're late?" No smile, no hello, no introduction. I apologized automatically, even though part of me knew I shouldn't have needed to. I sat down, smoothing my dress nervously, and that's when he looked me up and down, slowly, deliberately. Then loud enough for the table, and probably the ones nearby to hear, he said, "Oh, you wore that." The words hit harder than I expected. Mark and Julian exchanged a quick look, the kind people give when something uncomfortable happens and no one knows how to react. My face felt hot, my ears rang, and for a second, I genuinely wondered if I had misheard him. I laughed awkwardly and asked if there was a dress code I'd missed, trying to turn it into a joke. Ethan just shrugged. They had already ordered appetizers. No one had asked me what I wanted. For the next hour, the conversation revolved entirely around Ethan's work. Projects, deadlines, meetings, clients I'd never heard of. He spoke confidently, dominating the table, throwing around industry buzzwords like he was performing for an audience. Every time I tried to contribute, he either talked over me or corrected me in a way that made me feel stupid. When I mentioned something about a difficult customer at my store, trying to relate, Ethan waved his hand dismissively and said, "She doesn't really get how things work in the real business world." I sat there in silence, my appetite fading with every minute. I kept wondering if this was new behavior, or if I'd just never seen it so clearly before. Was he always like this? Or was he trying to impress his co-workers by putting me down? At one point, Mark asked how Ethan and I met. I smiled, relieved for the chance to talk about something familiar, and started explaining how a mutual friend had introduced us. I didn't get past the first sentence. Ethan cut me off mid-word and laughed. Honestly, Vanessa just felt bad for her. I was doing her a favor. My stomach dropped so suddenly I felt nauseous. That wasn't even remotely true. Our friend had warned me about Ethan's ego before setting us up, but said he was decent underneath it. I remembered that warning now with painful clarity. I excused myself to the bathroom before anyone could see my eyes fill with tears. Inside the stall, I leaned against the wall and tried to breathe. My hands were shaking as I texted my best friend Lena, asking what was happening and whether I was losing my mind. Before she could respond, I saw a notification pop up on my phone. Ethan had tagged himself at the restaurant on Instagram with the caption "Boys' Night." I stared at my screen, stunned. I was sitting 20 feet away from him, and he had erased me with a single post. When I returned to the table, the energy shifted. They were laughing about something, but stopped abruptly when I sat down. The waiter arrived with our main courses, and Ethan immediately started commenting on my food choice. I had ordered pasta, one of the cheaper items on the menu, because I was already worried about the bill. "Carb loading," he joked. "Bold choice for someone with your body type." Each comment felt small on its own, but together they cut deeper than anything he'd ever said before. I pushed food around my plate, barely eating, counting minutes instead of bites. Then the check came. The waiter placed it in the center of the table. Ethan picked it up, glanced at it briefly, then slid it across toward me. At first, I thought he was joking or pointing something out. I looked up at him, confused. He looked back at me and said calmly, "I don't think this is working anymore." I froze. He continued, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "I've been trying, but I'm just not attracted to you anymore. A girl like you should be grateful I even dated you this long." Then he stood up, grabbed his jacket and walked away. Mark and Julian followed him without saying a word. I was left sitting there alone with a $347 bill, a half-eaten plate of pasta, and the kind of humiliation that makes your chest ache. The waiter came over with a look of pity that somehow made it worse. I paid with my credit card, hands shaking, knowing I'd be dealing with that charge for months. I managed to make it to my car before breaking down completely. By the time I called Lena from the parking lot, I could barely speak. All I knew was that whatever I thought my relationship was, it had just ended in the most public, cruel way possible. Lena was at my apartment within 20 minutes of that phone call. I don't remember much about the drive home, except gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt, and replaying the scene in the restaurant over and over, like my brain was trying to convince itself it hadn't actually happened. But the credit card notification on my phone and the mascara stains on my sleeve were proof enough that it was real. When Lena walked in, she didn't ask questions at first. She just hugged me, handed me a pint of ice cream and a glass of wine, and sat on the floor with me while I cried so hard I could barely breathe. At some point, the words came spilling out in no particular order. The comments, the bill, the way he'd looked at me when he said he wasn't attracted to me anymore. By the time I finished, Lena was furious in a way that scared me a little. That was when she started asking questions. Not emotional ones, but practical ones. About Ethan's job. About the stories he'd told over the past 2 years. About the presentation he'd been stressed over the week before the dinner. I told her how he'd said he was nervous because he only had 5 minutes to speak, how he'd complained his boss barely noticed his contributions. Then at dinner, he'd suddenly been the star of the whole project. Lena went quiet. She finally said my name, in that careful tone people use when they're about to tell you something you won't like. She told me she didn't think Ethan was who he said he was at work, that she'd heard things through mutual acquaintances that never quite lined up, that his confidence always felt a little forced. That was the moment the floor shifted under me. After Lena left that night, I didn't sleep. I went through our old messages, our photos, our call logs. I noticed patterns I'd ignored before. Times he claimed to be traveling for work when his location showed him across town. Comments about money that never added up. Stories about co-workers that contradicted themselves months later. It felt like pulling on a loose thread and realizing the whole thing was unraveling. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a guy named Aaron, someone who worked at Ethan's company. He said he'd gotten my number through a friend and that there were things I should probably know. I hesitated before replying, my stomach twisting, but curiosity won. We talked briefly, carefully. Aaron confirmed what Lena suspected. Ethan wasn't some rising marketing star. He was an administrative assistant. The business trips were exaggerated or completely fake. The presentations weren't his. Worse, he was already in trouble at work for taking credit for ideas that weren't his. I felt stupid, embarrassed, angry at him, but also at myself for never questioning it. I was still processing all of this when my phone rang again. This time it was Ethan's mother, Diane. She sounded cheerful at first, asking how I was, making small talk. Then she asked if everything was okay between Ethan and me, because he'd told her we'd had a small disagreement, but we're fine. Then she mentioned his birthday dinner. Apparently, not only did his family think we were still together, they thought I was coming to dinner that weekend. More than that, Ethan had told them we had big news to share. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall for a full minute, trying to understand how someone could lie so easily to so many people at once. When I told Lena, she didn't hesitate. She said I should go. Not to cause a scene, not to get revenge, but to tell the truth. Calmly, honestly. She said Ethan's family deserved to know who he really was, and I deserved not to be erased from the story he was rewriting. I spent the next 2 days preparing, not in a dramatic way, but methodically. I reread messages, I took screenshots, I wrote down dates and inconsistencies so I wouldn't freeze up if I was questioned. I wasn't planning to attack him. I just wanted to stop protecting his lies. I also met Aaron for coffee. It was awkward at first, but he was kind and genuinely uncomfortable about the situation. He confirmed more details about Ethan's job and admitted that many people at work had suspected Ethan was exaggerating his role. He also mentioned that Ethan had been telling co-workers I was clingy and obsessed with marriage, which hurt more than I expected. By Friday night, I barely slept. My mind kept jumping between anxiety and resolve. Part of me wanted to cancel, block Ethan everywhere, and move on like a normal person. But another part of me couldn't stand the thought of him sitting at that dinner, lying effortlessly, painting himself as the victim. Saturday morning, Ethan texted me, acting as if nothing had happened, telling me his parents were excited to see me. I didn't respond. By the time I got dressed that evening, my hands were shaking. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted to look like myself. Calm, put together, honest. As I left my apartment and headed toward his parents' house, I didn't know exactly how the night would unfold. I just knew I wasn't going to lie for him anymore. I arrived at Ethan's parents' house a few minutes late, which I knew would irritate him, but I needed the extra time to breathe. The driveway was already full, lights glowing warmly through the windows, the kind of scene that normally made me feel welcome. This time, my chest felt tight as I rang the doorbell. His father opened the door with a smile and a hug, thanking me for coming, completely unaware of the tension coiled inside me. Ethan was in the living room, drink in hand, laughing with his relatives. The moment he saw me, his smile froze. For a split second, panic flashed across his face, before he masked it with something stiff and forced. He came over, hugged me quickly, and whispered that we needed to talk privately. I smiled back and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, that I wouldn't miss his birthday dinner, especially since he told everyone we had big news to share. The color drained from his face. Dinner was served, and we all sat around the table. His mother talked about how proud she was of Ethan's career, how excited she was about his future. Ethan nodded along, adding details that sounded impressive but vague. His sister kept glancing between him and me, clearly sensing something was off. I stayed quiet, letting him talk, letting him dig. Then the question started. His father asked about a client Ethan had mentioned before. Ethan answered with empty phrases that didn't actually say anything. His sister pressed further, asking specifics. Ethan deflected. I felt my heart pounding, but I stayed calm. When his mother finally asked about our big news, Ethan nearly dropped his fork. He mumbled something about it not being the right time. That was when I mentioned the dinner Ethan had taken me to the week before, casually naming the restaurant and the co-workers he'd been with. Ethan's hands tightened around his glass. The doorbell rang. His mother went to answer it, and when she came back with Aaron, the co-worker I'd met for coffee, the room shifted. Ethan looked like he might actually pass out. Aaron apologized for interrupting, but said there were documents Ethan needed to sign for work. Ethan tried to usher him away, but his father insisted he sit and join us. Someone asked Aaron about the presentation Ethan had supposedly led. Aaron hesitated, then explained that the presentation had been delivered by their boss, with Ethan assisting. Silence fell over the table. His sister asked directly what Ethan's title was at work. Aaron answered honestly. The lies collapsed quickly after that. Questions Ethan couldn't answer. Stories that didn't line up. His parents' confusion turning into disappointment. When his sister asked me about the restaurant, I took a deep breath and told the truth. About the comments, the breakup, the bill he left me with. Ethan exploded. He accused me of exaggerating, of embarrassing him, of trying to ruin his life. He stood up, shouting that I should be grateful he'd ever been with me. His mother gasped. His grandmother muttered something sharp under her breath. His father told him to sit down, and when Ethan refused, he told him to leave. Ethan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. His mother apologized repeatedly. His father looked exhausted. Aaron apologized too, even though he'd done nothing wrong. They insisted I stay for cake. Sitting there, eating dessert with Ethan's family after he'd left, felt surreal but strangely peaceful. When I finally went home, my phone buzzed with messages from Ethan, angry and threatening. I blocked him. The next morning, his family called to warn me he'd been spiraling. Later that week, I learned he'd been fired. Months have passed since then. My apartment feels like mine again. I trust myself more now. I'm not grateful for how he treated me, but I am grateful that the truth came out before I built a life on his lies.